Hello AP Biology students, let's go over the next section in Unit 1. And in this section, we're going to go over the first macromolecule known as carbohydrates. There's really no order, I just always like going over carbohydrates first. So first of all, carbohydrates are made of a monomer known as a monosaccharide. Remember mono meaning one, so one, and saccharide means sugar. The polymer form of a carbohydrate is known as a polysaccharide. And that's again because many monosaccharides are going to make up one polysaccharide. Now, the type of bond that forms between the monomers is known as a glycosidic bond. This again is just another name for the covalent bond that forms between the monosaccharides or monomers. One of the unique properties of a carbohydrate is that it's only made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So if you're trying to identify if a molecule is a carbohydrate and it has an element that's not carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, you know it's not a carbohydrate. For example, if a molecule has nitrogen in it, we can say it's not a carbohydrate. Now, the specific unique property with carbohydrates and these elements is they come in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. That means for every carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And like the name implies, it is a carbohydrate. For every carbon, there is a water molecule. Now, it's not actually going to be a water molecule, but it does make up H2O. I think when I show students that combination of for every carbon, there's a water, it makes sense to them. Carbohydrate, carbon and water. Now, the chemical formula of a monosaccharide is C6H12O6. So again, for every carbon, there are 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. And specifically, there are 3 different types of monosaccharides. We have glucose, galactose, and fructose. Now, they all have the chemical formula of C6H12O6. However, they're all isomers, which means these arrangement of atoms are going to be different within each molecule. For example, if you see glucose and galactose here, they look very similar. However, you can see this oxygen, this OH group here, is flipped in galactose. Even though this is a small change, it has big repercussions when these monomers try to bond together. Now, you can easily see that fructose looks very different from galactose and glucose. That's because it only has 4 carbons in its ring, where galactose and glucose has 5 carbons, specifically the 6th being above here in this carbon. Fructose is still an isomer. It has the same chemical formula. It just is built differently using those atoms. Now, when these monomers bond together through a dehydration synthesis reaction, they form something called a disaccharide. Remember, di means 2, so this just means that there are 2 monosaccharides that contain in this disaccharide. I typically talk about lactose, maltose, and sucrose when talking about disaccharides. You can see in each one of these disaccharides, there are a different combination of monosaccharides. This is because their structure is going to determine how they bond together between the different monosaccharides. Now, something you might have noticed up until this point is a lot of these molecules are ending in ose. Many of the carbohydrates end in ose because OSE, the suffix, means sugar or monosaccharide. However, not all carbohydrates end in the suffix ose, but a lot of them do. We also have a third group here known as oligosaccharides. They are between like 3 and 10, or I've even seen 20 monosaccharides. And basically, they are just markers the cell uses. They're known as glycoproteins or glycolipids, and they're just an important part of the cell recognition system. Your ABO blood system uses these sugars, these oligosaccharides, to signify or to tell what blood cells are yours versus other blood cells that may not be yours. So again, these are just a smaller amount of monosaccharides bonded together that the cell uses as like almost flags on the cell to say, hey, these are my cells, or hey, these are not my cells. Now, lastly, we have something known as polysaccharides. We have 2 different kind of groupings I like to talk about here. First being the energy polysaccharides. Again, these are composed of long chains of monosaccharides. Plants store glucose and other monosaccharides in the form of starches. Animals store glucose in the form of something called glycogen. Now, we can use starches to form glycogen. However, when we eat these starches, we have to break them down and then reform them into glycogen. And we use this glycogen as more of a long-term storage of energy so we don't have to constantly be eating. Plants use cellulose, which is obviously made of monosaccharides and ends in the suffix ose, which means it's a carbohydrate. Animals and fungi use something called chitin, I don't know, however you want to say it, but it's also a structural polysaccharide. Bacteria use something called peptidoglycan. And all of these structural polymers use different monosaccharides or have them bonded in specific ways to help with their structure. You can see that the plant cells use specifically in their cell wall long chains of monosaccharides, which are known as cellulose. Animals, plants, and fungi also do this and make these long chains of monosaccharides into a polysaccharide, but again, they use different monomers or monosaccharides to form these polymers. And like always, my meme, this is how I cut carbs. Love a good pizza.